episode using Grok as my trusty assistant and co-writer. So once again, we'll be doing that. Just want to make sure tomorrow is Good Friday. Tonight is Maundy Thursday. Apparently, I'm going to get my feet washed by my priest tonight. That'll be interesting. We have to. I had to go into the shop today to find out if I could get my tire fixed. And of course, once again, I have to buy a brand new tire, and I ended up having to do a couple other things. So this is always great. And Good Friday's tomorrow. I'm driving away up to my mother's house to spend Easter with the family. So we won't be doing much tomorrow. Besides, it's a holiday. We shouldn't really be doing much on a holiday. Anyways, here's my spy guy. In my intense spy thriller music builds and fades under voice. Yeah, well. Welcome to Spy Guy, the briefing room where we don't just read the headlines, we dissect the operations behind them, the power plays, the intelligence failures, the elite networks, and the smoke screens that keep the real story buried. I'm your host, David March, and if you're here, you know the game, trust no one at face value, especially when Washington's involved. Yeah, for sure. I tend to put on for anyone who's actually new, I tend to put my own spin on things off the script so I have further analysis than what Grok is actually thinking. Today is April 2nd, 2026, and the news is moving like a black ops extraction, fast, messy, and full of unanswered questions. President Trump has just fired Attorney General Pam Bondi in a stunning Justice Department shakeup. Well, not so. I know people have been calling for this for months. She's corrupt as the day is long. That's the lead story, but we're not stopping at the surface. We're going deeper. Why this happened now, that Steam Files fiasco that became her undoing, and how it all fits into the bigger pattern of rapid-fire changes and escalating situation with Iran. 3 deep dive topics today. We'll examine the loyalty calculus in Trump's second term, the intelligence blackmail shadows still lingering around Epstein, and what a nearing completion war in Iran really means for global power balances. This is the kind of episode that you'll find rewinding and questioning official narratives. Grab your notepad. Let's get into the field. Oh, great. These cutout descriptions. That's great. I like it. Okay, the dramatic ousting of Attorney General Pam Bondi. Let's start with the bombshell. Pam Bondi is out as U.S. Attorney General. Multiple major outlets are confirming it today. Trump has removed her after mounting frustrations boiled over. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche is stepping in as acting AG, at least for now. Some insiders have floated EPA Minister Lee Zeldin as a possible permanent replacement. And here's something else we have to consider. We saw in the initial creation of Trump's cabinet 2 distinct groups of people out of Florida and people out of New York. And they're kind of 2 different factions within the cabinet. And this might be showing that the New York faction is gaining strength against the Miami or Florida faction. So that's what I just wanted to add that there. Trump himself addressed it on Truth Social, called Bondi a wonderful person who oversaw big drops in crime stats, murders at the lowest level since the early 1900s, signaling she's moving on to the private sector. In Washington Peak, that's often code for "you're done here." Yeah, that's certainly true. This is definitely like the banning ouster. There's just like I said, she was corrupt as the day is long. But she did reduce crime stats. She did a decent job of getting like that kind of thing going. But the problem is that that's not what people want. They wanted more than just public safety. They wanted prosecutions of big name people. My understanding that despite people accusing Todd Blanche of being like a Democrat loyalist, he was actually for a time helping people get things done. Had a much better understanding of Trump's motivations than Pam Bondi. And when she found out, basically he would say, "Oh, just leave it to me. I'll take care of it. I'll get it smoothed over with Pam later." And then when she found out, she was furious and basically chewed him out and prevented him from being able to be as helpful at moving things along as he was trying to be. Why pull the trigger now, just 14 months into her tenure? Let's break it down like an after-action report. First, the timeline. Bondi was sworn in February 5th, 2025. She came in as a Trump loyalist from Florida with a reputation as a fighter. Oh, yeah. And remember when Tulsi Gabbard had her swear her in as DNI? So there was some like tightness on the sisterhood going on there that I don't think necessarily is still around. Early on, the DOJ, under her launch, aggressive moves, personal shifts, focus on crime reduction, and promise to unwind what Trump called weaponization of justice from the previous administration. Yeah, she was a big person killing off that weaponized. There was a committee on weaponization, and apparently she was working to undermine it from the beginning. So basically, I'm hoping that Todd Blanche will bring that back, or whoever replaces him. But cracks appeared fast. Reports have stalled or blocked investigations to Trump's political opponents. Court losses on key appointments. Judges ruling that some U.S. attorneys handpicked by Bondi were installing legally bypassing Senate confirmation. Internal chaos, including lawsuits from the field, DOJ officials claiming political privileges. Good. We're glad to see that. Then came the bigger friction. Perceived lack of aggression. Trump and his base wanted swift, high-profile actions. Instead, grand juries and judges reportedly slowed things down. In spy terms, it looked like operational friction, assets not delivering results on the ground. Yeah, that was, in some ways, I think it was good because it just showed people how corrupt the American system of justice has become. Like when you have a 99% conviction rate, you have a corrupt justice system. I'm sorry, that is ridiculous. You get arrested by the feds and you go to trial, you're going to go to jail. That is a fundamentally broken system. And then we started seeing all these Democrat jurisdictions and judges making same stupid rulings. But now I think one of the things that's happening, as there's been a lot of rumbling in the background, like President Obama hiring the 9 biggest defense attorneys in Washington, D.C. I think what's happened is the Florida grand juries come back and they need someone competent at the helm to run that for them. Right. Allies of Bondi pushed back hard in recent days. They pointed to photos of traveling with Trump to the Supreme Court as recently as yesterday, saying everything was business as usual. But sources close to the White House described a tough conversation on Wednesday. Frustration that had been building for months, and it finally hit critical mass. Yeah, I think whatever's coming out of those Florida grand juries, they want someone who is capable of doing it, and they do not, and Trump lacked confidence in her. This isn't isolated. Remember, Bondi is the second major level ouster recently. Back in early March, Trump fired Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem amid controversies over immigration enforcement optics and ad contracts and internal pushback. Yeah, and her being blatantly asked if she was having a flare with Corey Lewandowski. No one, you can't have that happen in that. He has replaced her with Senator Mark Wayne Mullen. Pattern emerging. Trump's second term is shaping up as a high-velocity loyalty and results above all with quick rotations when deliverables lag. Yeah, pretty much. If you can't give me this, I'm going to have to fire you. This is not, we saw this a lot in Trump term 1.0. Our lens in intelligence work, rapid leadership changes can signal either decisive house cleaning or instability that adversaries exploit. Will Blanche bring sharper focus? He's a former prosecutor with ties to Trump's legal team, potentially more aligned on priorities. I think he just knows man better. But any transition creates windows, leaks, morale dips, lost momentum on ongoing cases. What does this mean long-term for DOJ independence? Critics on the left are already screaming retribution politics. It's something they know a lot about. So I guess they know when they see it, huh? Some reporters say it's finally ending two-tier justice. The truth is probably somewhere in the operational fog, priorities clashing with bureaucracy and legal guardrails. Pause and think, if even a perceived loyalist like Bondi couldn't stick the landing, what does that say about the expectations at the top? We'll track who fills the next roles and whether this resets the DOJ's direction toward more aggressive transparency or just more internal churn. And then let's look at it. Now we go on to the second section, Epstein files controversy, the real breaking point. And yeah, it is a little different today. Because I got home late, I didn't rush give to my usual put it in a foreign policy perspective, but I don't mind it this way now too. So less of I don't have to read out all the graphic stuff. Okay. Now, the heart of the matter, the Jeffrey Epstein files saga that turned into a political IED for Bondi. From the campaign trail, Trump promised full transparency on Epstein. Bondi echoed that early. She went on Fox saying an Epstein client list was literally on her desk for review. That lit a fuse. Later, the DOJ walked it back. No single neat client list, but mountains of documents, flight logs, investigative files, the works. What followed was a textbook case of expectations, meeting reality, and exploiting. Yeah, what she needed to do was appoint a special counsel, go through the kind of do it like we would do here in Canada. We don't do special counsels, we do judicial review or judicial inquiry. So the judge comes in, he has subpoena power. He could put people in jail for like up to 2 years if they don't do it. And then you can have, then he provides the documents to the government of what he's found. And then we could have had a much more slower burn release of the files in a respected manner. Friend Professor Kenny is always saying that's what he thought we should be doing. He thinks that it should be a committee like the House Assassinations Committee. That would be a great one too. Like either way, like we could get this going. Instead, what we got was the mess we were getting. Congress stepped in with the Epstein Files Transparency Act, forcing releases. The DOJ eventually put out millions of pages. Reports say around 3 million released, with another 2.5 million held back for reasons like protecting survivors, ongoing prosecutions, or privileges. And yeah, so one of the things we got was some of the Bannon tape. And when there's a cut in it, and when it looks like Bannon was going to expose the Trilateral Commission and who's on it, because Jeffrey Epstein was the head of the Trilateral Commission, and that was cut out of the footage. I noticed that really early on when I restarted back up this channel. I also think a lot more files will be released, if not by this administration, but by future administrations. It'll be a lot like the Kennedy stuff, where, files will come out every so often, and we'll get more and more and more, and we'll get a clearer picture of what was that. But the rollout was messy. Remember those binders handed to the conservative influencers at the White House early on? Critics called them recycled material with no real new bombshells. Redactions were sloppy in places, intimate details exposed in some dumps, heavy blackouts in others. Bondi defended the volume release and pointed to FBI Director Kash Patel being tasked to chase down missing pieces. And oh yeah, we have all that stuff that's going on. Tyler Robinson case recently, and also the Jan 6 pipe bombing situation where a lot of people think they've arrested the wrong person. So Congress wasn't satisfied. House Oversight and Judiciary Committees, bipartisan heat grilled her. Subpoenas flew. Democrats accused stonewalling and protecting the powerful. Even some Republicans and Trump allies vented frustration. Where's the full accountability? Survivors groups and lawsuits piled on. Bondi testified defiantly going on offense, but the narrative stuck. This was botched or deliberately slow walked. Yeah, the Dow's at 50,000. She didn't even know what the Dow was. That's how dumb this woman was. Spy Guy deep dive. Epstein wasn't just a financier and a sex offender. He was a nexus, intelligence, adjacent networks, elite access, potential blackmail material. I really don't think it was a blackmail ring. I'm like with Mike Bench. There's no evidence of blackmail. This is much more, about arms trafficking and girls' goose deals. Business, academia, and foreign players. The files touch powerful figures across aisles and borders. When the public senses half measures or selective release, trust collapses. Conspiracy theories fill the vacuum, some warranted, some noise. And I often say it now, conspiracy theories just knowing the truth 6 months before normal people. Unforced errors amplified it. Early hype created impossible expectations. Handling of redactions drew bipartisan fire. A deposition for Bondi was looming later this month. Insiders say this backlash from Trump's own base became untenable. Questions that still linger in the shadows. Why the initial crime list framing if it didn't exist in that form? That is a good question, actually. Why did it? I think that was also, I don't think she really understood what it was. I think she thought she was dealing with a Heidi Fleiss type situation where she would have a black book that she's going on there and didn't realize it was just a treasure trove of documents and covering so much. I don't think she really understood what it is. And then certainly we didn't really understand it until we got a hold of all the first tranche of documents. What exactly remains sealed and why? Real national security or institutional protection? Yes, there's some. I think there's some that there will be some files we'll probably never see, and some of them might be destroyed or whatnot. But there's going to be more releases. There will be a Democrat administration sometime in the future who will not care about Bill or Hillary Clinton. They might even be dead by that time, and they will just release more stuff. And a future J.D. Vance or Tulsi Gabbard administration would also be interested in doing that. And I think we might see more under this administration, whoever, under Lee Zeldin. So we may potentially AG. Any intersections with broader intelligence operations or foreign influence? Yes. And we also know from these things, he was trying to get a meeting, a one-on-one meeting with Putin, nothing but the bodyguards. And Putin was like, why are we meeting with this guy? He was like willing to meet with some of his top brass with him, but it was just sort of like he never really got to Putin. So all this British BS about him being part of the Russian influence network is not true. He was part of, like I've said, banks have their own intelligence services. He was part of the Rothschild banking empire. And we all know how, we've almost all heard the story about how he, Rothschild back in after Waterloo, used it to used his advanced knowledge of the battle to basically battle results to rig the British stock market and make what would be considered billions or trillions of dollars today. So we just got to understand that the banking establishments were really the first real intelligence operations permanently, because what would happen is you'd have under, say, Queen Elizabeth I, you would have like a Walsingham who would create this incredibly interesting spy network. But when he died, it died with him. And that's why it was only not until the banks came along that they had a tradition of passing down how their intelligence networks would work. They would create the first permanent intelligence agencies that would lead to the creation of things like MI5, MI6, CIA. So those are kind of the things we got to take a look at when we consider this. So we guess foreign influence for sure, but he's not. So many people say he's a Mossad access agent. No, he's in bank, the financialist, which we often talk about. I kind of make the show about is the financialist institutions. People call it, whether you want to call it City of London or something else. That's what he was part of. This kind of super elite group of people who control things in the background. And yeah. Acting AG Blanche inherits the mess. Will he accelerate full sunlight or tighten control? History shows these elites' accountability moments rarely deliver clean resolutions to many interlocking interests. Yeah, we might see some stuff under Blanche, but I just don't think so. I think he's the acting AG. I don't think the acting AG usually makes big wave decisions like that. From an ops perspective, this wasn't just a PR failure. It eroded credibility on a promise central to the administration's drain the swamp ethos. Bondi's defenders argue massive volume was released under difficult legal constraints. Critics say it was theater. The truth is likely buried in their redactions, the unreleased 2.5 million pages. And we'll probably, like I said, have repeatedly said, we'll get some more of those sometime. This controversy didn't happen in isolation. It compounded other DOJ headaches, court losses on appointments, stalled probes, internal lawsuits. Combined, it painted a picture of a department struggling to execute under pressure. And God knows that's true. You only have 14 of the AGs actually assigned, right? Most of the AGs have John Thune hasn't brought through. And that's just crazy to me. Like, how we're not getting these AGs just because blue senators have the ability to block them. Like that tradition needs to go. There's a lot of little BS traditions that need to go out of the Senate. And unfortunately, I think if Mitch McConnell were still as good as he once was under the first Trump administration mentally, I think he could have got a lot. He would have all the AGs appointed. He would have all the judges appointed. I think that would have happened. He was good at that kind of stuff. He understood he had to create these are patronages, and that he's going to dole out patronage in a way that John Thune, for whatever reason, can't. And I think that's what we're seeing on there. I mean, McConnell had, I know some, if anyone follows the Ruthless podcast, there is a guy on there who is one of Mitch McConnell's staffers during the first administration. And he says, some guy comes in and says, I can't remember the quote, but it was something like, Trump is being blackmailed by the Russians or something like that. And Mitch McConnell says, that's what I believe. That's what the CIA believes. Something like that. Like he knew the score, and then he didn't do it. So he does raw political power when he does it. And it's kind of shame that he isn't. His mind is gone. Unfortunately, he's having problems, and then that's sad. That guy needs to be out of office and being taken care of by his great grandkids. Okay, just that's kind of how I see it. But Mitch McConnell, I still love him for doing like everything that everyone hated, blocking Merrick Garland from getting on the Supreme Court. That was important, and he gets my eternal respect for doing that. Okay, final of the three topics provided today. Broader Trump administration shakeups and the Iran situation. Zooming out, Bondi's exodus isn't a lone event. It's part of a pattern in Trump 2.0. Decisive, sometimes abrupt, personal moves align with results and loyalty. Noam at DHS earlier this year, now Bondi at DOJ. The message from the top seems clear. Deliver or depart. This style can cut bureaucracy, but risk expertise loss and continuity gaps. Classic trade-off in high-stakes environments. On the foreign front, the Iran conflict remains the dominant global wildcard. In his national address yesterday, President Trump described Operation Epic Fury as nearing completion after about 32 days. Claims Iran's Navy and Air Force largely ruined. Yep. Missile capabilities slashed by up to 90%. You did say decimated, which does, as I know, and someone mentioned on two-way yesterday, decimation only means destruction of 10%. Decimation is what the Roman legions used to do to those legionnaires who showed cowardice on the field. 1 in 10 men would be selected at random from out of each squad, and the other 9 would beat them to death with iron rods. That's what decimation means. Missile capable slash up to 90%. I think that's pretty reasonable. Senior leadership decimated, probably. I think he's got 10% of the leadership. Command structures hit hard. Trump said core strategic objectives are nearly met, with a possible off-ramp via negotiations, but warned of more strikes if needed, potentially bringing Iran back to the Stone Ages. You can only do that with nuclear weapons, guys, and I don't think that's happening. He extended pauses on certain enemy targets while keeping pressure. Iran's response, mocking missile launch videos, denials of ceasefire requests, and direct appeals to the U.S. public. Regional ripple effects, down missiles over Gulf states, oil market jitters, questions about the Strait of Hormuz. The strait has been closed and is only peaked at 112, 120 bucks in oil. We've seen that before without the Strait of Hormuz closed. So this is nothing new to us over here. everyone always thought it would be like $150, $200 barrel oil if we did this. And it turns out everyone was wrong. Spy guy angle. Wars like this always layer espionage, proxies, cyber, and disinformation. Watch for back channels, intelligence assessments on regime stability, and financial influence trails that might echo Epstein-style networks in the region. Yeah, someone's taken over his book, as they would say, in the finance field. Someone's running his network now, and I wonder who that is. Domestically, this hits gas prices, inflation worries, and public sentiment. Polls showing some softening amid the conflict. Trump's approach: maximum leverage, quick claims of progress, openness to deals if advantageous, whether leads to a stabilized region, nuclear rollback, or prolonged engagement is the open variable. Connecting the dots. Rapid domestic shakeups plus assertive foreign policy show a White House operating at high tempo. Success depends on execution in both theaters. Yeah, pretty much. This is part of if those who watched my Blaine Holt videos that I watched reviewing Blaine Holt will notice that this is exactly what he's been calling for. And he's like, you need to start doing something. And now we're starting to see the results. Okay, this is wrapping out the extended briefing portion of the show on Spy Guy today, Bondi ouster, and what it reveals about accountability to the top, the Epstein files quagmire that helped sink her, and the wider shakeups intersecting with the Iran endgame. These stories expose the friction between promises, bureaucracy, and power realities. Is this reset going to deliver the transparency and results voters demanded, or create new vulnerabilities? Drop here and tell in the comments what angles did I miss. Subscribe, share with fellow skeptics, and hit notifications when the next drop lands. Stay vigilant out there in the shadows. The real operation never stop. So, yeah, let me just go to, yeah, we have our 2 loyal listeners today. What was I going to do? I know that Tucker Carlson just dropped an hour video on what's coming next to the end of the global empire, but I haven't had a chance to review it yet. So, you know what? Let's watch some of this together. And I'll say the other thing. Tomorrow's Good Friday. I don't think, it looks like I'll be traveling. So, share screen. And
pretty much believed by air power alone. So that could happen, and it could accelerate in other ways too, probably too horrible even to think about, including the use of non-conventional weapons, nuclear weapons of some kind. And the effects of that would be what we don't know, because those weapons have never been used. The kind of nuclear weapons that modern nations possess are not even that closely related to the only ones that have ever been used 80 years ago in Japan. So what would happen next? Again, we can only guess, but it would be awful. So those questions were partly answered last night, but they're not really the right questions that we should be asking, because this is not just a war in Iran. It is, well, really, it's a pivot in history. What we're watching is a change of power globally. And so the questions we really should be thinking about, and that we're going to get the answers to fairly soon, would include who runs the world? Who's in charge of the world? Where are the real power centers? What is the nature of power? What does it mean to have power? How do you know if a country's powerful? Where does our power derive? Why is the United States a power exactly? And finally, what is the United States? Who are we? How do we understand ourselves? What do we stand for?
Yeah, I think this is kind of too basic for what I usually want to present. This is kind of like, I'm explaining this to the general public, and I want to do one that's more based on what, like, guys who have actual intel on the ground. So I'm going to bring up another does politics, because he's talking about some of the more interesting stuff out there. So I'm going to share the screen again. This one was much about what's going to come down the line, about what's going to happen with NATO and other things.
NATO is being destroyed. It doesn't have the cohesion or the strength or the partnership that it had before. That's what we're going to talk about in this video. Hey, Joaquin, good morning. It's Thursday, the 2nd of April.
Yes, we had a fantastic April Fool's Day yesterday. We had Artemis 2 launch. We had a lot of hilarious statements from the commander-in-chief back in the US. So
yes. And I don't think this is an April Fool's joke, but the dismantling of NATO is happening. I think Keir
yes,
Starmer gave a speech a couple of days ago that the geopolitical...
Yeah, there's a speech by Rubio. We are just mantling the old world order of the last 80 years, and history is returning, as I often say on this channel. And that's what we're kind of seeing here, is that exposing NATO for what it was, an empty shell of an organization that cannot be trusted anymore.
Scenery has changed.
right. Absolutely. Yeah,
Yes.
nothing is real. Like everything is absolutely fake, but it's the things that are happening at a tremendously fast pace. NATO is, I think, quite predictably imploding. I think people have been saying this for more than 10 years. 9 years ago, I wrote an academic peer-reviewed paper about the United States building its power in the Western Hemisphere and removing itself from this rimland strategy, which was about the containment of Russia. This ties in the whole purpose of the US strategy in the Middle East and the US strategy in Central Asia, the Pacific Rim strategy, and Eastern Europe or Europe, which NATO obviously ties in very much with that. And NATO has, you could say it has already served its purpose for some. You can say that ultimately it failed its purpose. You can say that
I think it served its purpose, and then, like a lot of bureaucracies, continued in inertia until someone came along and decided to take care of it. Mark Halperin, I've discovered him through two-way via, I think, Megyn Kelly. But what I found and I think it got pushed into my algorithm because I was watching Megyn Kelly at the time. But I had encountered sometime before with Mark Halperin on a previous podcast, and he was on the basically working for the presidential junket, and he walked in. And I think this was probably on the Ricochet podcast when I was back really listening to them heavily, back before COVID, back in the good times. And basically, Mark Halperin, it's the NATO Secretary General. He's all like proud. Trump walks in. He's like, and Mark Halperin's like, oh, this is going to go so terrible. And he's like, and then the president says, nice building. How much do you think we could get for it? And the
cooler
NATO Secretary General just like face completely collapsed. It was like, what?
heads have prevailed, or that you could also say that a new power group has come into power in the United States that has a different approach to global matters.
Right. Okay. And then how come it's fallen apart is Trump has said to NATO, come help out with respect to Iran. The NATO countries haven't done that.
That's right.
And then he's saying, well, wait a minute, because they're saying, look, Iran is not our war. And he's saying, well, Ukraine's not our war. Why
Right.
haven't the NATO countries taken part in this attack against Iran?
Well, the main reason that they're not going to take part is because they can't, and everything is expended already in Ukraine. And they weren't really prepared for such a maneuver prior to that.
Yeah. Gotta remember, as someone who's been studying the military industrial complex and all this stuff for 25 years, 27 years now. Oh, 28. I'm 48. So 28 years. We have to understand, we never thought we would ever have to fight a war on this scale of the Ukraine war ever again, except for maybe if North Korea invaded South Korea. And then and it was just sort of like, and since they got the bomb, they haven't had real interest in doing that. I have no idea how we're going to handle the Hermit Kingdom long term. But right now, that is definitely how we're seeing it, and what we're seeing with the we never expected to have to fight a major land war in Asia ever again. And now that so our understanding was that we'd go through 3 months of missiles and then we nuke each other. That was kind of what the baseline battle plans were, all the assumptions are. And so we have a military industrial complex that can't compete with the Russians because we don't have any industrial capacity because we ship it all off to China.
This goes back to, you had, during the efforts to, let's say, build ISIS while claiming to fight ISIS, where the real aim was to overthrow Assad in Syria. You had the British were called upon by Obama to use their air force to directly attack Damascus, and they refused. And this pointed to a lot of things, and it was
Tom Longo often talks about that as being like his record zip moment where he said, that's something new. The British are refusing to attack? What?
an important litmus test for NATO and Atlanticism. The whole point is that this kind of calls the question of what NATO is, and Trump has this brilliant way of communicating in opposites and reverses and calling the question in a way that you wouldn't expect. Like, you see, Rich, from the attitude of many Europeans, NATO, the US bases in Europe, are an occupying stay-behind army following World War II, right? Like the stated official, unofficial purpose of NATO was, number one, to keep the Soviets out, number two, to keep the Americans in, and number three, to keep the Germans down.
Right.
So obviously, you have this transatlanticism is built upon a Washington, Wall Street, London, and City of London nexus, in which Berlin and Paris play the role of junior partners. And ultimately, this project called the European Union was designed to address a complex, contradictory problem, which is that if the European countries are overly individual, then especially with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the normalization of modern Russia as a capitalist, reasonably democratic republic, then the sort of reason for existing for NATO and anti-communist operations as the psychological cover or the motivator for many operators, in particular with Gladio or Gladio 2 in Eastern Europe and Eurasia, disintegrated. So the European Union was brought into being, but it was always economically dependent on City of London banking in the final analysis. Now, in the post-World War II period, when they created based on Bretton Woods, but it was kind of a perversion of Bretton Woods, and they brought in this sort of Keynesian approach.
For those who don't know, Bretton Woods is basically, at the end of World War II, United States brought all the Allied nations together and based to a place called Bretton Woods, which I drove by once on a big, was like a big golfing country club. I once was driving through New York and I saw a sign for Bretton Woods 18 miles, and I really was tempted to go see the place because I was a big Peter Zehan guy, and that's what Peter Zehan talks about all the time. And now I'm further down the rabbit hole than Peter Zehan, but I just wanted to point that out. So if you guys want to know, so Bretton Woods is where we set the post World War II order, and even the Soviets were there. and they just said, screw you, we're out of here. But it was where they set up the post-World War II order that has lasted until basically February 24th, 2022.
To monetary policy, and instead of having a fixed transaction foreign currency exchange rate, they made it float. So they introduced markets into the currency exchange, and this was therefore something which the City of London banking institutions could profit. So NATO is ultimately the military of this post-World War II empire that Washington, Wall Street, London, and the City of London, together with the Franco-German power as their junior partner, collaborated. And this was connected also to, of course, trilateralism, where you would bring in Japan on the Pacific Rim. So a lot of these things began to change with the pivot towards China as a strategy to build up China and build upon this rift between the Soviet Union and China, which many analysts, many historians believe that Khrushchev in the Soviet Union may have either made a blunder, may have been misinformed by operators around him, or was directly compromised by NATO. And ultimately, instead of keeping the Russian-Chinese relationship primary, a sort of trade-off was made, and ultimately Russia or the Soviet Union lost its relationship with China. And
they were literally had little wars. There's a bunch of border disputes in the 1960s that really are part of this. So that's something that's not really well covered and known today, and certainly someone should. But that is definitely a situation. There's a whole bunch of stuff like that. Also, Chinese disputes with India as well. So
China, even though it was a so-called communist state, it began to supplant and replace Japan as an economic engine of production in the Orient, as they used to call it. So this is a grand geopolitical strategy that had unfolded. Now, there was a pivot and a desire to contain Russia. And the ideas behind this were mainly 19th century ideas that carried forward into the 20th century. Now, mind you, the planners and executors of World War II were men born in the middle, late 19th century. This is a whole different paradigm of thought. This is a world before the subcontinent and China and Latin America had experienced the modernization and economic boom that we would see in the mid to late 20th century.
Well, not necessarily. At one time, Argentina had a bigger GDP than America, and maybe with some funny business led to that not continuing until we get to Malay.
Century, especially in the first few decades now of the 21st century. So a lot of these ideas are actually anachronistic, strategically anachronistic, but you continue to see the proliferation of white papers and strategic guidance, strategic, I would say, advocacy, even lobbying in the form of the Brookings Institute, the Rand Corporation. I mean, you would have these little neoconservative outfits like the Project for a New American Century. All of these were built upon the idea that Russia had to be destroyed, had to be contained. So they had this idea that Russia is the heartland. Now you get into these ideas of Halford Mackinder, Reich, Spykman, and in the series, in the what's called bibliogenesis of the subject, the development of the ideas and text on the subject, they had arrived at this idea, the strategy that you had to create a series of hostile states or failed states all around Russia. So Afghanistan with the Mujahideen, failed state in Iran, tumult in Syria and Iraq, anti-communist or anti-Russian regimes in Ukraine and Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They developed something for Europe called Middle Europa, or the Visegrad Group, or the Black Sea to Baltic Initiative, or Baltic to Black Sea Initiative. All of these were similar to what Rumsfeld called New Europe. So this is the history of this ultimately failed project to contain and destroy Russia. And the thinking was that once they destroyed and contained Russia, then China would be prone. China would then be prone. And, you know, they moved too slowly. They moved impossibly. It was, a lot of it was like Don Quixote tilting at windmills, the old Cervantes novel. A lot of these were delusions, but they were very profitable. You know, they fueled the military-industrial complex, and they fueled a whole thought mill of think tanks and associations and grants and chairs of departments of universities. It was this profitable industry of aiming to destroy Russia. Mm-hmm. And Rich, it's much like, imagine if there was like an association or a philanthropy to cure heart disease, and then they cure heart disease, but this organization still exists. It still has millions of dollars of donors every year. So the plan to contain Russia was built off of what's called anti-communism. That should not be confused for people that don't want to live in a communist society or not being for communism. Anti-communism is a specific ideology. There's an old joke about J. Edgar Hoover and the old FBI, and one of his operatives runs up to Hoover and he says, "Hoover, you're going after this guy, but he's an anti-communist." And Hoover says, "I don't care what type of communist he is." So NATO is done. NATO is finished. It has, you can say, like I said, you can say it served its purpose. You can say that it failed its purpose. There's many ways that you could frame it or phrase it.
Right. And then what's the impact on the European Union, if any? Because the EU countries, all of them are in NATO.
Yes, that's right. The EU countries are not all in NATO, but many of them are in NATO. And they have...
Yeah, I was talking to someone this morning who is a Ukrainian lobbyist and works with the UN. And me and my guest, Richard, he won't say if he has a Ukrainian citizenship. And that's weird. Why wouldn't you just admit it or deny it? And he's like, well, we're going to lose all this business to the Europeans because if we get out of NATO, because so much of our economy is based on weapons sales. And I'm like, we don't want our economies, so much of our economy based on weapons sales. We want to have a domestic economy based on making products that we can sell to our own people that don't include blowing up a girls' school in Iran.
There has been, so I wrote, I interviewed for Iranian press about 12 years ago, and I was speaking to Iranian officials at the time, that the direction of the military in the European Union, by all of our best analysis, was that there would be a European army. That basically you're going to take the command structure created by NATO and then just remove the Americans from that command structure, and you have a European army.
Okay.
Now, this creates a problem for Europe because, again, there's two ways to look at this, and there's ways that you can put it that are going to highly offend Europeans, and then there's ways that you put it, you know, it depends on how you think about it. But There's a great line from the Bertolucci film, The Last Emperor, about China. And the Japanese are they're telling this emperor who they've made the last emperor, they've made him a puppet emperor of the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, which today is the region of Manchuria in China. And at a certain point, they hand him a bill. And he goes, "What is this?" He goes, "This is the bill for the Japanese forces that protect your country." And he goes, "What?" He says, "It's only reasonable that you should pay for your own occupation."
Oh, you're too funny.
It's only reasonable.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when Trump says that NATO needs to increase the spending or that they need to get involved in Hormuz, this is a slap in the face. You see, this is going to cause a political crisis in Europe. European countries, to have their own army, are going to have to spend 10% of GDP each, at least, maybe 15, 20% of GDP each. You understand? They're only paying between 2 and 4% right now, right? But it's like, well, of course. I mean, this is for them. If you're a European populist on the left or the right, you see NATO as an occupying army. So the idea that you should pay more for your own occupation is ridiculous. But people might pay more if it was their own army.
Yeah.
Like if there wasn't an occupying army and you're like, well, this is legitimately a European force, well, then maybe we would pay into that. But then it's like, well, what is the EU? Like, what are these decisions being made in Brussels? Why is there no accountability? Why are we so deprived of any process? Like people saw with the pandemic and then people saw with this Ukraine war that they're willing to exercise great legislative authority far beyond the provisions of the treaty itself. This is why I've been writing a lot about this problem of the EU's gambit to seize the Russian frozen assets or to issue a mutualized debt obligation, which would be disastrous. And it requires a radical reinterpretation.
Yeah, I mean, what he's talking about when he's talking about the seizing of the Russian assets. We didn't do that to the Nazi Germany, okay? What you're supposed to do with those kind of assets is you're supposed to pay off the bondholders, people who the Russians owe money to. Usually, in this case, stockholders, which the Biden administration didn't do for one reason. They wanted to have this narrative where Russia failed to pull it off. And like, no one bought it. Few people, no one bought it. And those who did know about it, most people didn't care. It was really just a stupid thing.
Of Article 122 of the TFEU, if they're going to ram it through, right? That's why you've got Orban or Fico pushing against this. And they know that Ukraine is going to be the center of a new European military if their aim is to destroy Europe and through it, Russia, right? So they're crashing Europe on the rocks of Russia. This is not in Europe's interest, but it is in the interest of the City of London. They have financed Europe before to crash itself on the rocks of Russia. Mm-hmm. The British, the City of London, financed Hitler all the way through. And then once Hitler begins to really attack the Soviet Union, Britain allies with who? The Soviet Union against Hitler. So, as I've said, this conflict in Ukraine has all the signs of pushing Europe to destroy itself once again. The US, and maybe can pull the UK with it, ultimately to side with Russia against Europe. And that's already happening economically and with the trade deals and the...
This is just so antithetical to so many people who've grown up in the myths of World War II and just don't understand what's happening. And this is not just Trump. Trump is just the catalyst or the spokesman for this alliance of interests that is doing this. He's just the guy at the tippy top. But this has been coming for a while now. There was a group of people, I've talked about this once or twice on the show before. Trump was recruited. Okay. he met, some people think he was raised as a young man to be this person. I'm not too sure if I think that far ahead on planning, but he was recruited by the America First movement to do what he's doing. And there's so many so much pressure on this being done through, say, Big Gay Patton, the Treasury Secretary. This is, financial moves have been going on for years, ever since I stumbled into it by an episode of The Duran, I'm pretty sure. And I just heard Tom Longo talking. I'm like, oh my God, it's my father.
Release of the sanctions that we're seeing, and
literally not my father, but my father had in 2007 told me that credit default swaps were a giant Ponzi scheme, and that he took all his money out of the market and put it into GICs at 5% because he wanted to protect his money.
The Alaska summit and so many other things that Trump has done with Putin. The question still remains whether the British can be pulled out of this sinking European thing and ally with the Americans. But it's also the point that the Europeans don't need to destroy themselves either. You see, we don't need to have a World War III to solve this.
Okay. Now, it seems to me with the European Union and NATO, like teams that are losing, they start falling apart.
Yes.
Because they get riven by disputes. And then when you talk in that atmosphere, when you talk about the European army, well, there are long-standing hostilities and resentments between different European nations.
Yes.
Like the French and the British, the French and the Germans, and the Spanish and the French, and so on. How do you see those playing out?
The main issue for European countries is that Europe has decided to define itself on these really puerile, mixed, incoherent value set that baby boomers, when they were in their 40s, back in the 90s, latched onto. So the European Union has a contemporary, well, not a contemporary ideology. They have a modern ideology, which was contemporary in its time, but it's 30 years past expiration. I mean, they're living in a world of 1996 where you had gay pride and these 1990s ideas of what a democracy looks like. Back when immigration, the number of immigrants was pretty low in Europe. So you could say things like, let's let all the refugees in. You know, there was maybe some rationale or reason that a normal voter, a normal European civilian could get behind some of that to an extent in the 90s. But ever since then, it's been a simulation. Mm-hmm. So they needed to have some value set that brought Europe together, that transcended what that generation believed to be all the mistakes of the past. They know that they need to bring Europe together. You understand what I'm saying? But they needed a value. They latched onto a value system that was based upon the cultural firmament, the cultural soil, rather, that generation emerged from. When they were young people in the 1960s, like in Germany, like in West Germany, for example, they were teaching about what fascism was. They had something called fascism studies in West Germany. And they didn't talk about the problem of the merger between corporate and state power. They instead talked about the givens of the time and the normal beliefs that people had within Europe, whether it was in Romania or Spain or Italy or Germany, that the fascist movements didn't create those ideas, you see, they just latched onto them to justify themselves. But fascism studies said the problem is those ideas. Like, the problem is patriotism. The problem is these are 1960s ideas that are deconstructions of what they saw as the prime movers of fascism, you see. But they weren't. Those were just the normal ideas that normal people had in their day and age in the 1930s. So they said the issue is the persecution of homosexuals. The issue is that people were religious. The problems are religion. The problem is heteronormativity. The problem is a nuclear family, right? Not that democracy was stripped from people, not that people's rights were taken away, right? Not that you had the merger of corporate and state power, like not so. And that was intentional. Why? Because after World War II, like Siemens and Mercedes-Benz and Oppenheimer remained the main oligarchical powers in Germany. So of course they had to fund philanthropically through the educational system a belief about what fascism was that gave them a pass, that totally distracted it. And that's what you got May of '68.
Yeah. So these are kind of things that, you know, you read a lot of history, you kind of pick up on it. But you don't, because most people aren't reading 500 books on World War II like I have, or on intelligence agencies. They just don't know. And then they're kind of surprised when I come in and say, oh, yeah, that's fine. I mean, I really had a Twitter fight with someone, well, not Twitter fight, but they're like talking about Martyr Made on X. And that's the guy that Tucker Carlson brought on to talk about World War II, and he said, you know, I like every so often I like to piss off my razz up my British friend by saying that, you know, Churchill was the secret villain of World War II, and all these people spurred out over it, and I'm like, oh my God, every military historian could make that argument. It would not be that hard, but because I'm like a priest of history, I can have the conversation, but from Western civilization, this 80-year myth of World War II, people aren't familiar with those kinds of ideas, and so they kind of freak out over it, and they just don't get it. And it's like, I can make that argument. That wouldn't be that hard. That being said, I can make I would say that we brought in Americans into World War II for their own good because of the screw up of funding Hitler. So yeah, just a lot of that stuff. I only heard some of these ideas recently myself, but when people explain it to me, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes total sense from what I could see from what was going on. But other people who are not in this world, who are not one of the priest classes, are not comfortable with having the conversation just yet. And they're now getting, because the greatest generation is dying off and the silence are going away, like my father, like they just don't have, there's just the magic words that I've described them: racism, anti-Semite, Islamophobe. They don't have any meaning anymore to people of younger ages. And when Pierce Morgan calls Nick Fuentes, you're nothing but a racist misogynist, it's like, yeah, so what are you going to do so what now do you have, old man? And Pierce had nothing. It was just sort of like, oh, well, I had like I don't care. You can call me all those terrible names. He's a Christian nationalist, and though I have my problems with Roman Catholicism, as I think I mentioned yesterday, and definitely at the point where it's a League of Orangemen when I need them. But just for me, because Roman Catholicism is the original globalist organization, and it is a real problem in the world. It's basically the Roman Catholic Church would be perfectly happy if we were still in the Dark Ages and they were still running the show. That's kind of like how I see it. And yeah, get back to the show.
That's where you got everything: post-structuralism, critical theory, the Frankfurt School, right? And these ideas have been the foundation of modern European Union thought, right? And that's why people, like, it doesn't resonate with anyone under 65 or under 55. It just doesn't resonate at all because it doesn't speak to anyone's lived experiences anymore.
Okay. Okay. Then the other problem, major problem that European Union has is, or actually, sorry, let me say it another way. The major asset that the European Union has, and Britain as well, is green energy, an
Yes.
abundance of wind,
Yes.
an abundance of sunlight, even during nighttime,
Yes.
and even on a foggy day in Scotland or Denmark in December.
Right.
Oh, you're keen. You're keen.
What are they doing? Yeah. Well, this is, again,
So you can. How are they going to have an army with wind powered tanks, solar powered planes?
well, remember that, with Japan, for example, going up until World War II, the United States was supporting Imperial Japan and was granting it access to energy. And it was by cutting them off, it forced Japan to attack. And a lot of the strategies, plans are multidimensional. Their operations, their plans, their grand strategies, and they're designed to be one plan tucked inside of another, tucked inside of another, tucked inside of another, like Russian dolls, like those Russian dolls, right? That's how these grand strategies work. So in the 1960s and 70s, you had the development of these energy pipelines from the Soviet Union to Europe, right?
Yep.
The British and American strategy was to, through the spectacle of a type of thawing or détente of a type, to have the Soviets sell energy to Europe. And they developed the unity and brotherhood pipelines. And those were the main ones. This is decades and decades before Nord Stream, right? Nord Stream is a very interesting and different project that Merkel and Putin and others have been developing as a hedge against a disaster that is brewing through those older pipelines should Ukraine go rogue, which has happened. So Merkel's a very interesting character. However, in talking about the energy crisis in Europe and how it was manufactured by Washington and London to create a dependency that Europe had on Russian energy. Now, if then the order comes through, I'm going to put it very simply. It's never that simple, but let's say the order comes through now that Russia is cut off. Well, now you have to attack Russia to get your energy. Like, what is our energy doing underneath Russia's soil?
Right.
You see? So,
but that also sets up for the US, and if the UK had any brains, to sell energy to Europe. Now, the US is doing that, but the UK is not doing that. The UK is not even using energy for itself. We have enough
yes,
for ourselves.
There are the issue with energy that the US sells to Europe. This is primarily processed through Poland. And we're talking about LNG. This is derived from fracking. We're talking about LNG fracking energy from the US to Europe. It's processed in Poland and then sold to Germany from Poland.
Okay, now hold on, Joachim. You mean it doesn't come into Rotterdam from the US?
It does also, but it has to be processed in Poland. So think about, like, this is very similar to with Iran. They were producing their own oil, but it had to be processed by the British and then sold back to the Iranians to use it. This is like the American Revolution when the colonists were producing goods that maybe there was some finishing stuff done or just the tax collected by the British and then sold back to the colonists by the British their own product.
Okay.
right? So
yeah, it's just interesting. I didn't know about this with the liquid energy, but that does make a lot of sense. So the facilities are in Poland, but this all makes supply lines harder and harder. Why can't the Iranians have their own refineries so they can use their own create their own domestic production? They have to go to the English, and it's just like that way. So nation states need their own development, and where we see that these old imperial systems still exist to this day. So I know a lot of people call it the British Empire. I'm not too sure. I think of it as organized as some people seem to think. I see it more as like a religion or ideology where people are trapped in this imperial line of thinking. But it's always nice to have a bit of a conspiracy theory. And that's what this show is kind of about these days.
The LNG from United States has to be refined primarily in Poland, and then it's distributed by pipelines to Germany. But there's no transatlantic pipeline. So you're basically talking about a Robinson Crusoe strategy of bringing in on boats after boats after boats. This is like a permanent, this is more like logistics that you have in a war than a permanent infrastructure. It's very expensive. It doesn't solve the problems, right? There is Greenland, that you see the King of Denmark and the King of England now, before the Queen, the City of London, all together have conspired to deprive themselves of energy. You see, Greenland has between 30 and 60 billion barrels of oil equivalent in untapped energy. And that's just what we know about. This is without getting, into exploration. These are known discovered reserves in potential. And Denmark and the European Union have blocked getting in there over and over again. Mm-hmm. So the UK has its own oil that it's not using. Now, in thinking about this, however, is that you had these ideas that were introduced by quack scientists over 100 years ago, but they were pushed very heavily by Rockefeller, that there's a limit to the amount of oil in the world. Yeah. Okay. And then based on that, the idea is that we're going to keep our strategic reserves for some future date, and we're going to get the rest of the world to burn through their oil, their energy. And then at some point in the future, right, by holding back alternative energy, by holding back whatever else, by making sure, look, I'm not, this is not my field, but I know just loosely, I'll disclose, I'm not a chemist. But there are some, but Tom Luongo is. Mm-hmm. But if we're talking geopolitics,
and Tom Luongo did explain to me the process, and it went right over my head. I'm not here for that. We're both gamers, Tom. That's our common attraction. When you start talking about the pieces on the Go table, and I'm like, God. I like to play games with like 2,000 pieces, like moving parts. World in Flames is a thing.
I'm your guy. And I can tell you that the energy crisis is manufactured, and it's been built upon this idea that there's a limit to the amount of oil. Yeah. Right. There's other thinking and other studies that seem to indicate that these are not fossil fuels, that they're not based upon dead dinosaurs or whatever, right? That there's some other process in the earth, in the peat, that's constantly generating oil, that for all intents and purposes, it's an unlimited resource.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'm not too sure about unlimited, but it doesn't come back as the way that, it's kind of like trees in the sense that, it takes a while to come refill up the things. So, but we've had oil wells that we thought were dry, and then we come back 20, 30 years later, and they're 1/3 full again. So how much can we extract out of that, and how much should we extract out of that is an interesting question. But that's kind of the thing that we got to start thinking about. I'm very big on where the direction of travel is going, especially after what I kind of came to the conclusion on what that space rocket launch was yesterday.
A lot of the crisis in the post-Soviet space and the rise of Yeltsin was based upon Yeltsin and his government being told by Clinton and others, like, hey, we're going to release free energy. We're going to release free energy, and you have all this oil, and it's going to be worth nothing. And if you try to sell it at a premium or market price, you're only going to encourage us to invest and release free energy or alternative energy. And Yeltsin went for it. They didn't have the information, right? Putin and the later group, they understood that there's probably not a limit to what we have, and you're never going to release free energy. And we're going to sell oil at market price. We're not going to be a banana republic, an exploitation zone for you. So Greenland is untapped reserves. You know, Venezuela was kept effectively off the market up until recently. See, all of this was creating a focal point in the Middle East, a focal point around Saudi Arabia, around Iran. And yet you have Venezuela basically being unused. Like last year, Colombia, which has 1/100th of the known reserves, was supplying more to the United States, 3 times more to the United States than Venezuela as of in 2025. Right? Colombia is not an oil country. They have a little bit, but that shows you how little Venezuela was actually putting out.
Yeah.
There was a policy of keeping oil off market. Right? Oil is the fuel of economic development. I mean, this is going to improve people's lives, but we had to get past this mythology of global warming. We had to get past this mythology of peak oil, all of these Rockefeller lies about energy that have been driving wars and conflict for a century. Mm-hmm. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It does. It does. So then turning to Iran. So you said there's a focal point there with all the oil and the gas. How is that going to play out in terms of the energy? Ras Laffan is offsite, is not working for 5 years. By the way, I worked on Ras Laffan when it was during the construction phase for 4 years. I wasn't a construction worker. I worked in trade.
I was talking to a guy who is an oil guy from Louisiana, living in Malaysia right now and works the fields there. And he says the fact that Ras Laffan will be off for years is bullshit. It is nonsense. It's taken some damage, but these guys always say it's 3 to 5 years, and then suddenly, it's back up running 6 months later, that kind of thing.
And communication and stuff, right? But it was quite something. And then with regards to Iranian energy, and then what's happening in Iran?
Yeah, well, things are changing all the time. And one of the things that we can point to with Iran is that it has been encouraged. Like, you have to look at the end results of things and understand how foreseeable those end results were to understand what the plan was. And Iran is going to become a primary supplier of energy, is going to continue to be a primary supplier of energy to the global East. And that's going to be its position. But in the West, we're going to have Greenland, we're going to have Venezuela, countries like Saudi Arabia and the GCC countries could probably provide to both. Israel is going to be dependent on GCC countries. So they're going to have to resolve the Palestinian question in a way that Arabs can get behind. That's what Trump's purpose was with the 20-point plan. Unfortunately, the present government in Israel has been pushing back against this and trying to sabotage it. And they've been trying to make permanent the temporary position of the yellow line. but according to the agreement, they have to then ultimately withdraw from all of Gaza. Gaza is supposed to be an economic development zone, which the Palestinians are the main benefactors and beneficiaries of. So,
yeah, guys, Gaza sits on one of the richest trade routes in the world. There's no, that's one of the reasons why Hamas exists, to prevent the use of that massive trade route. It's a blockage on the world that Israel is basically trying to take over. But if you want to, all you have to do to enrich Gaza, put 4 to 8 train lines through it, and charge a 10 to 15%, 10 to 20% tariff, and it will become the next Dubai.
That is one of the things that is on the horizon, and Iran has been a, how to say, false nemesis that has been propped up in Western mythology, and it had served a purpose in the past. Like, this is why I was introducing these ideas of rimland and heartland that were really derived from 19th century thinking before China existed as a global power, as an economic behemoth that it has become. And there was a time when American and British policy towards the containment and destruction of Russia required the destruction of Iran. And the destruction of Iran has nothing to do with whether it's a democracy, whether it's a monarchy, whether it's a theocracy. This is irrelevant. This is irrelevant to grand strategy. Unless you're talking about particular cases in banana republics of what are called personality states. Other than that, any rational, coherent Iranian state was a problem in this old thinking, because it's a zone of economic development that provides stability in that region. And provided that you have rational stability, that's going to work against efforts to contain Russia. In other words, a truly sovereign, rational state is going to say, hey, Russia's our neighbor, let's trade with them. Well, that works against this rimland theory and strategy of containment. So the politics of Likud and Netanyahu grew up in the 80s and 90s within that paradigm, right? But we're no longer in that paradigm. But they attached to themselves, okay, we're going to have a greater Israel that's going to be possible with the destruction of Iran. So in other words, the collective West had grander strategy connected to the destruction of Iran. That was related to the destruction and containment of Russia. But the United States has broken with the policy, not because of some epiphany or goodwill or, a dream or something like that. It's not viable. It's stupid. It doesn't work. It's not cost effective, and it's militarily and economically impossible in light of China. That's the point. In light of BRICS, in light of the rise of the global South economically. What you have to understand, and what people need to understand, is that there were far more, I don't know the right word for it. The left would say right wing, but there were far more ethically different people that were born in the late 19th century from the West that were advocating to just nuke China, to use nukes in the Korean War and to expand the Korean War into nuking China. That the only real solution, because they projected long-term population growth trends, industrialization, that the only way to keep long-term the Western colonial, so to speak, empire going would be the physical liquidation of the Chinese people. So many people said, well, that was the point that we made the mistake. We didn't nuke China back in the 50s. We should have launched the whole arsenal at them, was the thinking. But you'll recall that the Soviets had by and large extended their nuclear shield to China, although that was questionable. But it was the Rosenbergs, so to speak, in the story that leaked the US bomb blueprints to the Soviets. And then the Soviets quickly began developing the bomb in the 50s. So, people like the Rosenbergs might have been people that say that today are the reason that China exists, right? So it's a very interesting story, but Iran, there was a couple of years ago, the president of Iran died in a strange helicopter accident. That was Raisi, right? And Raisi was a principalist.
Yes, that was a very interesting, strange incident where he's flying around and these two, his team are flying around in these two old helicopters in a very rainstorm. It's like, dude, you should have just waited till the weather to clear before taking off in those things.
So-called hardliner, that's what we call them in the West, but in Iran they're called principalists. The current president has been in there for like a couple years, like 2 years, Pezeshkian, and he's a reformer. He's a liberal reformer. He's not anti-West. That's the strange thing. So, but what's weird is that this is something like, in my career and in my life, I've had contact with Iranian intelligence, Hezbollah, Mossad, CIA. And I know it's going to piss people off, and it's narratively not what the Iranians, obviously, they don't want that out there. I don't speak on behalf of Iran, right? But there is good reason to believe that the Iranians took out their own president, that they did regime change a couple years ago.
When they took out President Raisi.
And this is why I wanted to show this thing other than the Tucker Carlson thing, because this is much more interesting. Like the theory that the Iranians took out their own president because they didn't want the hardliner in charge.
Yes.
They did that.
Yeah, there's a very big conspiracy theory, so to speak, that's how it went down.
Why would they have done that?
Because they were non-agreement capable with the West, and they didn't want to break out of this cycle of this paradigm of destroy Israel and Israel destroy Iran and Iran destroy Israel and this back and forth. It was this convenient ruse that kept getting pulled out in geopolitics time and time again. It gave Israel its reason for existing and for saying that it had legitimate security needs to expand in the region, to make war, to slaughter the Palestinians, to occupy Lebanon, to issue ultimatums to Syria now with al-Shara, al-Julani. Israel's entire geopolitical mandate in the region has been justified by the Iranian threat. And then you have the Iranians saying death to America, death to Israel. You see? So I'm not saying that the Iranians don't have historical grounding or legitimate reasons for some of these impulses or political legitimizing narratives. But it looks like they already solved the problem. What's weird is that you have to take understanding how, why was Likud Netanyahu politics supporting Hamas?
Yeah.
Right? And once you understand that although Hamas had a lot of legitimizing narratives, if you're Palestinian and you're looking at Arafat, right? You're looking at the Fatah, you're looking at the PLO, the PLA, and they look like sellouts. They look like they're compromising with the West. And because that agreement, made the Camp David and so forth, when Clinton was trying to broker these, was not a good deal at all for the Palestinians, but it was the only deal that they could get. Mind you, the Soviet Union had just been destroyed.
Right.
That was at the time, it was at this time that the United States and the British were running around trying to reorganize a lot of the world that they could. They ended apartheid in South Africa. Like, they let Nelson Mandela out of prison. They made him the president of South Africa, even though he had been a Soviet agent before being in prison for 27 years. Well, now there's no longer a Soviet Union to weigh in. So this was the beginning of this post-Cold War unipolar moment of American power in the world. And they thought, They said, now's the time that we're going to make the Palestinian deal. Now's the time that, and then they also destroyed Yugoslavia. They did the war in Iraq. Like, they began to reorder the world at this time. And you had people like Shimon Peres in Israel that were willing to do things, but they were not concerned about what the Palestinians would accept, only what the Knesset or Israeli politics could accept, right? So this led to an impasse in Israel-Palestine. But nevertheless, Palestinians were like, man, the PLO, PLA, Fatah are sellouts. And yet that's exactly what was used to manipulate the rise of Hamas in Gaza. It was back in those elections in 2006 and 2007 in Gaza that Israelis were funneling money to Hamas so that they could win those elections. And that's what divided the Palestinian Authority. Ever since then, the West Bank and Gaza have been politically divided. That's been for 20 years, they've been politically divided, right. You see, and that's how you conquer a people, is you divide them. So this was the Israeli strategy, but they supported the extremists. And so now you have to look at Iran. Now, the Israelis never had the power or the infiltration or the depth, neither did the City of London or the Americans, to infiltrate the leadership in Iran. This was a natural product of its own narrative and its own metabolic processes. If you think of a country like a physical organism is the best way to do it, okay? It was its natural immune response to going back to the assassination of Mossadegh, going back to interventions and even Israeli and British moves against the Shah. I mean, even though the present Iranian government is anti-Shah, they understood the limitations and they understood exactly what was going on. So there had been a wheel that had to be broken, And so here's a big tell, is that Raisi dies in a helicopter accident, right? Khamenei approves and supports then the ascension of the present president, Pezeshkian. The Israelis try to assassinate Pezeshkian. That's the thing. Like, they were fine with Raisi because he was a hardliner.
Yep.
Right.
You see the issue. They tried to assassinate the reformer.
Yeah.
Because the reformer is a...
Yeah, Israel is always trying. That's, I think, part of the Joe Kent narrative, is that Israel is influencing. We want the peace deal, but Israel doesn't. And that, I think, is what's going on with that particular op. Is that he's going around letting people know that Israel is screwing up the war. We're trying to negotiate with these guys, and every time we negotiate with someone, the Israelis blow them up. Because Israel's goal and America's goal, though, are similar but different.
Agreement capable. That's who's been making these agreements. That's the government that you have Aragachi and you have all these people are his people. They're the ones that have been making the agreements with Rubio, that they ended the 12-day war. They're the ones that, probably had an agreement on February 27th.
Okay, and are there agreements being made now? Because I hear reports of there's the obvious apparent regime, there's the IRGC and the mullahs,
yeah,
and then there's the civilian government and the army.
Yeah, this is news to me what Walking's going to drop next.
And that they're in communication and agreement with the United States. Is that going on?
I would frame it like this. I would say that Iran is under singular leadership. There are no factions or divisions or breakaway groups that the United States or anyone else is communicating with. That is a narrative that is attached post facto in light of ignorance over what the difference between Raisi and Pezeshkian already represents. So the reformers are the main in power. The IRGC is in power, right? IRGC is in power. When you look at support for the Shia Arc, Hezbollah, pro Iranian activities in Yemen with the Houthis, or in Iraq in the parliament, or with the paramilitary militia. These are all supported by the reformers. This is all, so IRGC and the reformers are on the same page. There's not a separate civilian government. That is the president. That is the government of the presidency of Pezeshkian. It is, but there's not a division in leadership. They apparently, again, I know it's going to piss people off. There's people in Iran that aren't going to be happy that I'm saying this publicly, but it is more likely than not that the Iranians themselves took out Raisi.
Right. Okay. Well, then turning to the situation now and the United States, how is this going to end? How is the US going to extricate itself or finish this off? Because I don't think it's going to go on much longer.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, I'm trying to communicate things at great risk to having access to continued intelligence and information, and I should emphasize that the Iranian state as it exists has total coherence. They're definitely a unified force. So again, your question was what?
Well, how is Trump going to end all this? Because I don't think
Trump can end this at any time.
Yeah, that's something that I'm trying to get over the heads of some people that was on my two-way group this morning who were very confused. It's like, well, we don't have any defined objectives. Perfect. That means you can declare victory at any time because no one knows what the objectives are, right? That's the beauty of the situation. I remember watching History Legends get interviewed by Viva Frey and Robert Barnes on one of their side bar episodes, and he said, and Robert Barnes was like, "Why? What does this mean? Like the end the Nazification of Ukraine?" Well, it means whatever Putin wants it to mean, doesn't it? You make the goal so vague and that you can declare victory on it as easily a start of a pen. So we're using ambiguous language, especially in the tele-ops, to get that kind of message across. So that's, I think, a good place to leave it here. I'm traveling this weekend. I'll go Good Friday to my parents' place in Ottawa, and then I'm traveling back home Monday for this. Of course, this is going to eat up my gas bill like no tomorrow. But I think that, getting out of the house is worth it. And then I got to start packing this place up because I'm not going to be living here much longer. And it will be very interesting how my new living arrangement goes. Anyways, like I say, this has been the Spy Guy to all the agents out there and all the ones who might watch in the future. Be sure to like, share, subscribe if you want to see more of this stuff. And also check out my locals page. I'm trying to keep it updated with videos, but times for someone who is not working right now, time seems to get sucked up by all sorts of things. So thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye. Spy Guy out.